Welcome back to my channel, guys. This is Quiet Blink, scary stories that creep a little closer with every sound. I'm just starting this channel and I really need your support. Please subscribe, like, and share. Every click helps me keep these stories coming. Don't blink. Quiet blink. The doorbell rang in the night, tearing apart the dead silence of the house. It rang so late that Greg didn't immediately understand where he was. With difficulty, he lifted his head from the pillow and, trying to make sense of what was happening, sat up in bed. Greg didn't want to get up and still clung to sleep. But the chime came again and again without stopping, so he had to open his eyes. Greg stepped out of the bedroom and turned on the light. Downstairs, the doorbell was howling. As he went down to the first floor and headed for the door, he couldn't help running through his relatives in his mind, wondering how their health was. He thought of old fat aunts, remembered grandmothers and grandfathers whose contracts with this world were about to expire. Greg reached for the doorknob but didn't take hold of it right away. A doorbell in the middle of the night could mean one of two things. Either some friend had got so drunk his wife threw him out, or someone had died. As in most towns around the city of Ashford in Raven County, in Mill Creek, there wasn't much work. It seemed the only stable money in the area came from teenagers and pickled drunks who constantly needed beer, whiskey, and pills. So when Greg opened the front door, it seemed to him that the man standing by the steps belonged exactly to that category. He looked drunk. But there was something else about him. Depression? In his line of work, he'd seen that sort of thing very often. Over the entire existence of his business, many people had come to him with those signs. Depression, grief. But it was the dead of night. And he put the man in the first category. A drunk had come to beg for booze money. "What do you want here? Get the hell out." The man didn't move. "Am I correct," the stranger replied, "that you provide funeral services?" To Greg's surprise, the voice didn't belong to a drunk. It was even calm, with notes of despair. "Yes," Greg said, "only I don't serve people at night. Come tomorrow during the day and we can discuss everything and take measurements." The man outside didn't answer. He silently started up the creaking steps. As the stranger drew close, he sent a jolt of terror through Greg. He sensed some kind of danger but didn't show it. His face remained as cold as ever, though every muscle in his body tensed. The man came almost right up to him. He unzipped his jacket, reached into an inside pocket, and Greg had an instant thought, "That's it, this is the end." But nothing of the sort happened. The stranger pulled out a wallet and, opening it, said, "My name is Errand, and this is for troubling you by waking you at night." He held out a thick wad of bills to Greg. "But I can't wait any longer and don't know who else to turn to." A plea stood in his eyes. "May we come inside and discuss my problem?" Greg, taking the money, didn't object and let the night guest in. They sat at the table in the ghostly light of the lamp hanging over it. Greg brought them each a cup of green tea. In the light, Aaron's face was yellow, the color of nicotine. Greg thought his new client was very ill and unlikely to last long. Only his brown eyes seemed alive. They looked at him with a secret hope. Greg's house was large and, to Aaron, cold. Still, everything in it was arranged in the best possible way, and the spirit of death seemed to hover there. The house kept its peace. Only the faint crackle of logs in the stove and the chirring of crickets outside disturbed the silence. They sat without speaking. Greg saw that Aaron needed to pull himself together and overcome something inside. It was clear not only in his eyes, but in the downturned corners of his mouth. "So what did you want to talk to me about?" Greg finally broke the drawn-out silence. "My son," Aaron began. He sipped the hot tea, set the cup on the table, and continued in a trembling voice. "My son is dead. Or rather, his grandfather killed him, and I helped make it happen." "You're saying that?" "No." Aaron waved a hand and shook his head. "But his death is on my conscience." I didn't believe him. Greg kept silent. Aaron looked older than his years. His hair had gone gray, and there were big bags under his eyes, as if he suffered from insomnia. "He was killed. But my wife won't accept it." "Why?" "Because it was her father." Aaron glanced around as if to make sure no one was watching them and went on. "It all started when my mother-in-law died. And to be honest, I was happier than ever because that witch had given my nerves a hard time. I was happy that she was finally lying in damp earth 6 feet closer to hell. You've heard of the Henderson house, I imagine?" Greg nodded. Stories about that house circulated all over the state. The same kind of scary tales you see on TV. And may he be damned if they were true. "Well, then there's no need for me to tell you what kind of devilry went on there. And just imagine, she was my relative. But the happiness after her death didn't last long. Her husband, my father-in-law, moved in with us. Our house is big, and unfortunately, there's room for everyone. He moved because in the wake of his wife's death, he had a stroke and needed care. At first, everything was fine. He didn't bother us. On the contrary, after his wife died, he became somehow calm and uncommunicative. Soon he stopped talking altogether, and then he had another stroke and stopped walking." Aaron raised the cup to his lips with trembling hands again and took a small sip. He sat with a pale face, as stamped by the fear he'd lived through. "So a few weeks after the stroke, our son Ben began to cry at night all the time and call me to him. And every time I asked what was wrong, he said his granddad was standing by the bed watching him, and it frightened him. I always calmed him down. He said it with a mystical intonation, as if he had done it in vain, and told him it was all in his head that Grandpa couldn't walk because of the stroke. And then my son, my only son, died." Aaron began to cry. Tears ran from his eyes in 2 small streams. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. Greg waited in silence, idly turning his teacup in his hands, not understanding why he was being told all this. At last, Aaron calmed down. His eyes were red. His face now seemed defenseless. "Sorry," he said. "I still can't come to terms with it." "It's all right," Greg assured him. He'd seen this kind of thing very often. Aaron went on. "I remember well the evening when, reluctantly and angrily, I came to his cry again. The end of summer was hard. Work was a mess. 2 mountains of paperwork on my desk, and to dig out from under them, you had to work 24 hours a day. And the old man needed constant care. And then Ben screaming at night. That night I was ready to kill him for it. Kill him for waking me up again. I already pictured myself walking over and strangling him with my big hands. How he would finally shut up. I went into his room, turned on the light, and saw him clutching the blanket with his hands and teeth, repeating, 'Granddad, he wants to take me, he wants to take me.'" Aaron's voice dropped to an anxious whisper. He shrank in his chair, and suddenly I felt sorry for him. Despite the fact I had to get up early, despite the fact he'd woken me again, I felt sorry for him. He was so defenseless. I sat down on the bed next to him and began to repeat, as I'd done many nights already. "There's no granddad here. You're just imagining it. It's just the play of shadows and your imagination. It's time you grew up and stopped calling me over nothing, understand? But he didn't want to understand me because he knew what my wife and I didn't know, and didn't want to know. Unfortunately, we never believe children. That evening, I barely managed to get him to sleep and closed his door behind me. When I was about to go down to my own bedroom out of the corner of my eye, I saw the door of the room where the old man slept was ajar. I went over, opened it, and walked in. It smelled of urine and old age, and the old man himself stank of the grave. The smell was unbearable. I half expected worms to crawl out of his hair. He was already dead and yet alive at the same time. The old man lay there. As for walking, he didn't even seem to be breathing. I bent down and listened, but weak streams of air were coming from his nostrils. I left his room, decided my wife had simply forgotten to close the door, and went down to my bedroom, my eyes sticking together again. In the morning, I went to wake Ben since he needed to go to daycare. I always dropped him off on my way to work. When I walked into the bedroom, the boy was lying on his back, dead. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. His eyes were unnaturally wide open, glazed and motionless, and his hands were clenched in the blanket. The doctors couldn't identify an exact cause of death. They said it might have been a combination of pathological coincidences that led to his breathing stopping during sleep. A combination of pathological coincidences? What nonsense. What does that even mean? When my wife saw it, she screamed like she'd been cut. Now she's being treated in a psychiatric hospital. It was then, leading her out of the room, that I saw that the door to the old man's room was ajar again, although I clearly remembered closing it. Of course, I didn't say anything to my wife about it. You know, there were more pressing matters. And I didn't believe it myself. Aaron fell silent. He looked out the window, his restless hands worried an already empty cup. His chest heaved with agitation. His eyes were wet and red. Greg thought he was almost certainly thinking about his wife lying in the hospital. All these images rising with Aaron's story sent a shiver through Greg, but the thoughts flashed by too quickly to stick. In truth, he didn't much care. He listened without particular interest. Listen, Greg broke the silence. I'm not a psychologist. Why are you telling me all this? If you want to order a coffin and arrange your son's funeral, say so. What's the point of all these details? No, of course not. I buried my son a month ago. He glanced wistfully at his cup and, lifting his head, added, I want to order a coffin for my father-in-law. You know, I don't like jokes, Greg said. What you're telling me? It's hard to believe, Aaron finished for him. I understand you, and I understand how insane it sounds. But I'm not joking. Here, open this and look. He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and handed it to Greg. Greg reached for it, took it, and sat back down. He looked at Aaron questioningly. Take a look inside and then we'll go on. Greg carefully tore it open. It was stuffed full of crisp $100 bills, as if no one had touched them. There's exactly $20,000. You can count it. For a while, Greg held the envelope in his hands, flipping through the bills, then set it aside and asked, You want me to help you kill the old man? Nothing like that. Aaron shook his head with a wan smile. He's been dead a long time. You'll see for yourself. All I want is a sturdy coffin that can't be opened, and your help to bury him. He paused a moment. I could, of course, say no more, but I'll tell you the rest to be perfectly honest with you. You may think I'm crazy, but I want to warn you. Greg nodded. He had already decided that if necessary, For that kind of money, he'd rid the world of this old man. He was already imagining where he'd spend it. Aaron rubbed his forehead as if helping the last scraps of memory come back to life, and continued in a trembling whisper. After my son's death, I was left alone in the house with my father-in-law. That night I woke up and saw him standing by my bed, looking at me with his deathly eyes. I flinched. The image of the ajar door to his room and my dead son's face flashed in my mind. That was when I finally understood. He did it. He stood, motionless. A horrible smell came off him, the stench of rot and decay. He was a living corpse. His eyes were set deep and burned with a flickering fire. He looked like a spider trying to swallow a fly, and from the moment he moved in, the whole house had become his web. Aaron spoke slowly, and the notes of fear were audible in his voice. The next night, I didn't wait for him to come to my room. I went to him to finish this creature off. He lay in bed without moving, and then, in the bright light, I saw what pierced me to the core. After Ben's death, the old man looked as if he'd grown younger. His gray hair and beard had darkened. The once waxy, deathly skin that stretched so tight over his cheekbones it seemed almost transparent, glowed with a blush. His cheeks were fuller, his lips brighter than usual. He seemed simply filled with life. He lay motionless like a disgusting leech, bloated from overfeeding. That thing had sucked the life out of my boy. I took the pillow from under his head and pressed it over his face. I stood there with that pillow for 5 minutes, maybe all of 10. I kept waiting for his hands to come up and clutch at life, for him to fight back, but nothing happened, as if he were already dead. Finally, I lifted the pillow. His eyes had rolled back, only the whites showing between his lids. An ironic smile wandered across his face, straight from the pit. I pressed my head to his chest. There was no breathing. He was dead. I went to my bedroom. In the morning, I planned to call an ambulance and say my father-in-law had died in his sleep. But when I went into his room, I saw him sitting on his bed staring out the window. And the next night, I woke again and saw him. He was standing much closer now. Greg had never believed in the afterlife. He always denied the existence of living dead, bodiless spirits of evil that came from another world and could inhabit a corpse whose soul had departed. He'd always treated that kind of nonsense skeptically, but the picture in his mind made even him shudder. I want, Aaron continued, you to help me. For 3 nights in a row now, he's crept up to me while I sleep. He just watches, and his lips keep moving. I haven't slept for 2 days. And if this goes on, I'll crack up or end up next to my son, living with this thing. Greg drove his old hearse, based on a Ford E350 with a convenient slide-out deck for the coffin. Under the hood beat an untiring iron heart that ticked steadily and without complaint, like an expensive Swiss watch on his wrist. He left his house at midnight as they had agreed. The sky was covered in black clouds, but there was no rain. He felt vigorous and confident because it was a good deal. He'd already received $20,000 and was to get another $5 if all went well. And the costs were laughable. The simplest draped economy-class coffin cost him less than $600. Of course, he had a wide selection of premium coffins. Solid hardwood, the octagon, the cathedral. But why spend money on some nut? A draped coffin made of simple boards would do. He had to sweat over the latches in the workshop, but nothing complicated. It turned out quite well. He turned off the highway and drove to the end of a dirt road. Aaron was supposed to be waiting for him outside, but he wasn't there. Greg rolled up to the last house on the left, just as Aaron had said, and killed the engine. A strong wind pounded the car door and shoved him in the chest as he climbed out of the cab. Lights were on all over the house, but around it was darkness and silence. The black shadows of the trees, washed in moonlight, seemed filled with a mute mystery. Everything looked frozen and gloomy, so much so that a thin white snake of fog creeping up the road to the porch looked like the only living part of the nature that dwelt here. The sight sent trickles of fear across his body, and he didn't like it one bit. A thought flashed through his head. Greg, think what you're doing. Maybe you've gone crazy like he has. But the money was too big to be an idiot and refuse. The front door was slightly ajar, and Greg braced for something unpleasant, because as he approached, a disgusting smell seeped through the crack. He hadn't expected the stench that hit him when his foot crossed the threshold. The air was thick with the smell of rot. Under different circumstances, the reek inside would have made him refuse the job, but the pay was good, and the money poured strength into him that was far greater than his fears. After a second shudder at the threshold, inhaling the foul odor, he moved down the hallway as if this vile place were an ordinary house. Inside, the silence was funereal, and he listened warily. Would he hear footsteps, voices? Though lights burned everywhere, Greg didn't want to create extra noise by calling out to Aaron. An unaccountable fear clenched his heart. Probably Aaron had simply fallen asleep while waiting. When he'd seen him at his own house, the man had looked terrible. Greg wanted to get back in the car and drive away as fast as possible, but he couldn't do that. Gritting his teeth, he strode down the corridor. The floorboards creaked underfoot. He walked slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. On the wall, Greg saw a pencil portrait, apparently of their late son. It was covered in a layer of dust, cobwebs drooping from the corners like torn rags. The boy didn't look 5 yet, a sweet child with soft features. Greg thought they must have had the portrait done in the city at some festival. On such days, the streets were full of artists drawing live portraits. At the very end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. Greg advanced, and after a few steps, he could already see a sliver of the room through the gap. Coming closer to the open doorway, apparently a bedroom, he saw some stains of indeterminate color leading farther up the stairs to the second floor. At first he thought it was dirt, but it had a yellowish-purple tint. He looked more closely at the stains on the floor and saw pieces of decomposing flesh and skin in the shape of a human foot. Real horror seized him as soon as he reached the doorway. It felt like a bad dream you can't remember later without trembling. A black silhouette stood bent over the bed where Aaron's body lay. The figure sensed a stranger and whirled around. But the thing that stood there couldn't have been a living person. The skin on its forehead had split apart, revealing a skull covered in a yellowish, purulent slime. Only cartilage remained of the nose. Above it, one eye gleamed with a deathly light, seeing nothing, while the other was a black hole. Flies crawled over its face, the lower lip hung, exposing rotten teeth. Its hands looked like dried claws. Greg's face turned pale. Terror gripped his heart and squeezed with icy hands. His breathing became a rasp. This just can't be, he told himself. Understand, what you're seeing can't be. It's impossible, he froze, afraid to move or utter a word. The air seemed electrified with tension. He felt every cigarette he'd smoked in the last 10 years and his blood pressure spiking and heart racing. No one afflicted with such a disease could remain alive, and he knew that if you hooked him to a machine and checked the EEG graph, there'd be no squiggles, only a flat line. The drunken fog of big money that had surrounded Greg all this time cleared in an instant, and he spun around and ran. It was all true. Everything the man had said. True. Greg dashed out of the house without looking back, and within seconds, he was at the car. He rummaged frantically through his pockets for the keys but couldn't find them. And that was the end. Now stand here and wait for that damned minute when this rotting old man shows up. Search all your pockets again. He searched more carefully, even turning his pockets inside out. Some loose change spilled out, but the keys were nowhere. Greg stood by the car, wondering what to do next. He could leave the car, but then he couldn't avoid questions from the police. Greg cut that thought short. He peered inside, pressing his face to the glass. The keys were in the ignition. Greg yanked the door open and got behind the wheel. From all the horror, his head was spinning, and that scared him. How much everything had changed in such a short time. He tried with all his might to focus on the road. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The speedometer needle touched 50 miles per hour and continued to rise steadily. The night was clear. A glowing band of the Milky Way stretched across the black sky. The moon floated above the dark trees along the road, drifting with the car. The highway was absolutely empty at that hour. The town looked deserted. Greg was glad of that. He didn't want anyone seeing him in that state. Time and distance seemed endless. His legs trembled. Pressing the gas, Greg nudged it up to 65 miles per hour, and his Ford shot home. There, he thought, the madness of this night would end. Greg awoke at some sound, and errand, the old man's corpse, the coffin. This whole night of nightmares dissolved into the world of shadowy phantoms. He didn't know how long he'd slept. It might have been an hour or a whole day. Maybe none of it had happened. He felt cut off from reality. It was a dream, he thought. Of course, nothing like that could happen while awake. It was the worst nightmare in the world. But he had an irresistible urge to get up and make sure in person. Throwing back the covers, he slowly lowered his right foot to the floor, then his left, and felt the cold bite into his soles. If he was dreaming now, then it was far too real. My God, he thought as he stood, and you thought it was only a bad dream. He thought he heard some sound. Something. He held his breath and listened to his pounding heart. And there really was a sound. Not the one that had woken him, but another. The faint creak of floorboards. "Aaron," he called without much hope. But it couldn't be Aaron. The door to his room opened and let in a shadow. What a disgusting stench. Slow steps in the darkness pierced Greg with fear to the depths of his soul. Now, true horror came for him. It entered slowly, drifting through the hollows in Greg's body and filling them with acrid smoke. He began to shiver uncontrollably as if with a fever. "Who's there?" He began to back away, trying to quell his shaking in the face of the reek. He couldn't make the person out, but he heard the dull breathing. Greg understood who it was when the thing came closer and stepped into the faint shafts of light coming through the window. There wasn't much light, but enough. It was the old man. He fixed Greg with his one eye. His mouth grinned. He stood motionless. "Granddad, he wants to take me, he wants to take me." Aaron's words floated up in Greg's mind. With a mocking smile, the old man stretched out toward him a glossy hand, all slime and scabs, like a drowned man who had lain in water too long. The flesh didn't just sag. It was all but dripping on the floor. The old man smiled the way people smile when they meet an old friend. And then Greg, drenched in sweat, finally did wake up, for real this time. He sat up, gulping air, the blanket wrapped around him. Bright, warm sunlight flooded the room, leaving not a trace of the night's nightmare. He jumped out of bed, unable to believe it had been just a bad dream. The hands on the wall clock showed 2 in the afternoon. At exactly 5 o'clock, Greg sat at the table drinking tea. Thanks to the workload at the office, the nightmare had completely melted away. His spirits were back. The shadow of that night slid off him like clothing. Still, to get rid of those thoughts completely, he decided to check the safe with the cash. He remembered distinctly the moment he had put the white envelope in there. Greg stood and went to the safe. For a moment he hesitated, dreading what might be inside, then reached for the lock. But the doorbell rang. He went to the door, reached out his hand, suddenly slow and limp, as if the bones had been taken out, gripped the handle and pulled it open. And in that instant, Greg's jaw dropped. The old man was standing on the doorstep. Only he wasn't as he had been yesterday. He looked 10 years younger now. His hair was darker. He wore dark glasses that hid his eyes, and he was leaning on a cane. "Good afternoon," he said in a creaky voice. "I need your help. You see, there's been a misfortune. My son-in-law passed away last night. Could you take the measurements for a coffin and handle the arrangements for the funeral?"